The physical geography described in the first part of this lecture forms a useful background for understanding the emergence of the Russian Empire that dominated this region from the 14th to the early 20th centuries. The first city, important city in what became the Russian Empire was Kiev, now the capital of the independent state of Ukraine that we'll talk more about later. Kiev was founded in the 9th century by the Varangians or Vikings, who were known as the Rus, who came down the river systems from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea and established their capital in Kiev in the late 9th century. By the 11th century, Kiev became one of the major cities of Europe, and the reasons are not hard to divine. First, it was located on a major trade route, as was said, from the Varangians in the Baltic to the Greeks in the Mediterranean. Secondly, as indicated in this map, it was located on what has become the grain belt of the Ukraine, and therefore a region that provided an agricultural surplus that could support a major urban center. It became a major center of commerce in this part of what became Western Russia, and also the seat of what was to become the Russian Orthodox Church. All of the good news for Kiev, however, its location on the Dnieper River, its surrounding by good agricultural land, was offset by the unfortunate location at the western edge of that great steppe that stretches across Central Asia. For from that steppe in the 13th century emerged the world's great conquerors, the Mongols, who in 1240 not only overran Kiev, but in fact decimated it and burned it to the ground. It would be several centuries before Kiev regained even a shadow of its once glorious past. The future of Russia then lay not in Kiev, but north in the forests, north of the steppe zone, where natural vegetation provided at least some defense against the Mongol herd who overcame much of Western Russia. The history of Moscow is a bit peculiar because Moscow was not a major commercial center, unlike Kiev in the south or Novgorod, another major commercial city to the northwest of Moscow near the Baltic Sea. Instead, out of the forest came a military and political machine that gradually beat back the Mongols and established central authority that became the Russian Empire. This process involved four major elements. First, the emergence of a strong central government around a hereditary monarch known as the Tsar. This is the first of the great Tsars, known as Ivan the Terrible, who ruled Russia in the 16th century. Second, around the Tsar, a powerful military that formed the backbone of the Tsarist forces that would fight the Mongols. Third, a hereditary landed elite that became what is called a service aristocracy that provided service to the central government in Moscow in exchange for land grants. This hereditary landed aristocracy formed the backbone of the social and economic structure that underlay the Moscow state. And finally, enforced labor, initially tenants or peasants, and after 1639, enforced labor or serfs. The strategy of the Russian state was to expand gradually on its periphery through military force, establish a perimeter of control, occupy this area by giving land grants to the most successful aristocrats and military commanders, who were then allowed to populate and cultivate these landed areas using enforced labor backed by the authority of the state and the muscle of the Moscow military. Using this process, Moscow gradually expanded outward, as illustrated in this map. From its original enclave in the forests in the early 15th century, they expanded in the 16th century by the capture of Kazan and Astrakhan on the Volga River, leading from what was emerging state of Muscovy down to the Caspian Sea. Then, in the 17th century, running rapidly across Asia, occupying Siberia all the way to the coast on the Pacific. Finally, in the 18th century, under Peter the Great, capturing a foothold on the Baltic Sea that became the capital of the Russian Empire in St. Petersburg, and later in the 18th century, under Catherine the Great, expanding south to take the Crimean Peninsula in 1783, giving the Russians a permanent outlet in a warm water port on the Black Sea, which connected through the Straits of Bosporus to the Mediterranean. And then finally, in the 19th century, the occupation of the Caucasus in the south, of the mountain pastures of what is now the Central Asian republics further east, and finally, on the coast of the Pacific Ocean, the Russian Far East, which was led to the establishment of the city of Vladivostok. This history of rapid overland expansion through military force and centralized power contrasts the history of Russia to what we will see in the next lecture in Europe. Here is a distribution of political power in medieval Europe, and you'll notice that unlike Russia, it's highly fragmented into relatively small independent states. Moreover, this fragmented polity was dominated to a significant degree by the rise of new coastal, commercial, urban bourgeoisie, independent merchants and traders who dominated the coastal cities of Europe and formed an important part of the economy of these emerging independent states. And finally, with the emphasis on this coastal region, the development of strong overseas navies that played a significant role in the emergence of Western Europe. It also stands in contrast to the United States, which at the same time Russia was expanding to the east, the fledgling American Republic was expanding across the breadth of North America to the Pacific Ocean. But there's an important difference between American and Russian expansion, and it lies in part in the nature of the external threat. The Russians faced a significant threat from the Mongols and were constantly fighting for every inch of land. By contrast, the Native Americans, while brave fighters, lacked the technology, organization, and other elements that made the Mongols such a threat to the expanding Russian state. The American frontier, as Frederick Jackson Turner has argued, was a realm of freedom in which independent settlers could expand with relatively little dependence on the central government or the national military, quite in contrast to the expansion of the Russian state. So Russia can be explained largely by the necessity to expand outward overland against a significant external military threat that was to shape the politics and mentality of Muscovy becoming Russia from that time on.